So I read this book called Fault Lines written by Carl Pilmer. Carl Pilmer is a sociologist who talks about how he has conducted the largest scale study on family estrangement. The reason he came into my purview was I heard about this article in the New York Times written by him and Mel Robbins that was somewhat controversial, called Life's Too Short to Fight with Your Family. And I actually recorded a discussion of that article and some of the critiques that it received, but I honestly felt like it was just a discussion that required a level of nuance not always found on YouTube. So I decided I'm probably just going to keep that for Patreon. Probably going to post that in March on Patreon. But regardless, when I covered that article, I looked into Carl Pilmer and I found out about this book of his based on his research done into the Cornell Family Reconciliation Project, which is, according to him, the most extensive in-depth interview study ever conducted on family estrangement and reconciliation, a survey of 1,340 individuals and interviews with marriage and family therapists. So I read the book. And basically, I didn't love it. There were quite a few critiques that I had of what I perceive to be Pilmer's bias towards reconciliation. So this video is going to have two parts. One, which is some of the most interesting things that I learned about family estrangement based on this book, and then a skeptical critique of his perspective, because, spoiler alert, he framed it as though reconciliation is pretty much always a good idea, and I respectfully disagree. Let's get into it. Part 1. What I learned about family estrangement. One thing that I learned from this book is that parent-child estrangement is not as common as people like to frame it, and that might actually be the opposite point of what Pilmer was trying to make. According to his own studies, 27% of people are estranged from a relative, but only 10% of those are parent-child relationships, meaning 90% of parents and children are in contact. Out of a lineup of 10 people, only one of those people is estranged from their parent or child. And also, I do wonder if there might be a sampling bias here at play, because people who tend to respond to these surveys might be more likely to be estranged if they want to talk about it with someone in an anonymous setting. They have something, that they want to get off their chest. So that's also something that I wonder about. But basically, when people cite that 27% rate, but they're talking about parent-child dyads specifically, I feel like that's misleading, because you should know that 27% rate is not specific to parents and children. It is across all different types of relationships. So that distant great aunt that you don't talk to, that counts as an estrangement. Something else the book talks about is that there is a stigma to estrangement and people keep it secret out of shame. And I already knew that, for people who are actually the ones making the choice to estrange themselves from a family member, sometimes they don't want to talk about it because they get a lot of people trying to convince them that they made the wrong choice, or you should make up, you're going to regret it one day. But this was a good reminder that this is also something people try to keep secret when they're on the receiving end of someone in their family not wanting to talk to them. And something that I didn't see Pilmer really talk about in the book was the possibility that some people might want to keep it secret, not necessarily because they think others are going to judge them, but because it threatens this sort of happy, perfect family facade that they like to put on for others. Because as we know, when people are estranged, that threatens not just the relationship, but also their image. And some of the reasons why they're estranged from those people in the first place is because they care so much about their image. Another interesting tidbit from the book was that divorce often weakens the father-child bond in particular. I was actually just talking about this with my husband. I was talking about the concept of dads abandoning their family, meaning not just the spouse, but also the children. And how this is just absolutely bizarre to us, because if you have raised a child and this is your child, presumably you care about them, you love them, how could you just abandon them just because you no longer love their mother? And there are studies showing that a dad's loyalty towards his children and his involvement in his kid's life largely depends on how he feels about their mother, which is why you so often see dads sort of starting over, starting a new life with a new woman, having kids with her, seeming really dedicated to her kids, and then completely forgetting about family that they abandoned. It's pretty fucked up if you ask me. There were 5 common themes that Pilmer talked about in estrangement. One is the power of a single volcanic event. This idea that like pressure has been building up for years and the last straw that causes it to explode, that's just the last straw. You're not really seeing all of that pressure that was underneath the surface. And once the dust settles, once the lava hardens, it can be hard to reconnect because people tend to get more rigid in their story about what happened and their notions about what the other person is like. They tend to ruminate over it. They tend to get sort of more and more self-righteous that they were right and the other person was wrong. And so he talked about this need to sort of act quickly, kind of like before the lava hardens, strike while the steel is hot or whatever the expression is. So for example, if, you have a really big conflict with your daughter, act quickly. Try to talk about it before it's too late. And he kind of touched on this, but I think often the single volcanic event is a metaphor for something deeper going on. Like, let me give you an example. One time I was having a fight with someone in my family and I broke a nail, like right in the middle of it. And I started crying, not over the fight itself, but over the nail, because the nail to me was kind of a safer target onto which to displace my feelings about the fight. And it was a metaphor for how I was already feeling. I was in pain because it was like a pretty low place where the nail cut, so I was like bleeding in my nail bed. It felt like something irreversible had happened. It felt like I was powerless to change it. All of that was how I was feeling in the fight itself. And so sometimes there's this volcanic event, this like rupture over something that feels to the outsider like it might be small, but when you really look at the deeper meaning in it, it's completely emblematic of what's been going on in the relationship up until then. Another theme is diverging views of the past. So Pilmer proposes that we need to stop imposing that other people see the past the same way that we do. And, in some situations, I think that can be true. Like if you had a mutual conflict where both people had a little bit of responsibility in what happened, sure, like I might perceive it as if that person spoke to me in a rude tone and they might perceive it as if I was defensive. We can agree to disagree and be like, listen, I don't need for you to necessarily agree with my sense of reality. You can just sort of like acknowledge that I have a different reality than you. But what about more serious situations where like an abuser, for instance, refuses to acknowledge the fact that they abused their victim? I don't think it's wise to then tell the victim, stop imposing that your abuser agree that they hurt you. Just accept that they're not going to see things that way and move forward with them. Absolutely not. I mean, yeah, you should accept that like what other people think and feel is not within your control and you shouldn't try to necessarily change their mind about it. But I also don't think it's wise to continue engaging in a relationship with them if that's the case, if they're unable to see the harm that they've caused you. He also says to stop expecting an apology and focus on the future, not the past. And again, this could be great advice for someone who is just experiencing some sort of rupture with someone in their family, but I don't think it is wise to say without a caveat, because a lot of people reading this book are going to have been people who experienced abuse. And telling those people, stop trying to get your reality acknowledged, stop expecting an apology, stop dwelling on the past, not helpful at all. And the last 3 themes of estrangement that he talked about were unclear boundaries, the role of third parties, and breakdown in communication. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. I could see, definitely in a lot of estrangements, these are themes that usually come up. He also talks about this notion that for people who are estranged, it never stops hurting. I believe that, absolutely, because if this is someone who is really important to you in your life, it's kind of always going to be hovering over your head in the back of your mind. Like there's this person who was a part of my life and now they're not a part of my life anymore and maybe I'm going to regret it one day. However, something that I don't think Pilmer really acknowledged is that both options are painful. Yeah, doing that is painful. Choosing not to talk to somebody from your family and constantly doubting yourself about that, that's painful. But so is having somebody in your life who constantly violates your rights and your boundaries, who's constantly harming you, who doesn't have the capacity to engage with you in healthy ways. That's really painful too. And so it often just comes down to which is the lesser evil. He seems to think reconciling is better because it's painful to be estranged, but he's forgetting that it's also really painful to be in relationships with people who are constantly hurting you. And for someone to finally walk away from a family relationship, like it usually has to get to a point where things are pretty bad for them to say, okay, I accept a lifetime of always hurting and grieving over this because I just cannot be in your life anymore. He talks about how the family can be a great source of support and social capital. So losing your family as like collateral damage can be really detrimental. And this had me reflecting on not a family estrangement, but like a friendship fallout that happened years ago in one of my friend circles where somebody had an issue with somebody else and then they started behaving in ways that I didn't really appreciate. So I decided decided to cut off that person, and then that person asked all of their friends to cut me off because of that. And so basically this whole friend group imploded because of what originally started as a conflict between two people. And a couple years later, I reconnected with one of those friends who was told to cut me off. And we talked about how it was hard for us to suddenly have all these different branches of social support fall apart, all because of an issue that started off being between two people that really shouldn't have concerned us. And one thing that I found really interesting that he talked about is this idea of defensive ignorance, which is when people claim they have no idea why they're estranged and they're completely lying to themselves and others. So it was really validating to hear this even from someone with a pro-reconciliation bias, because it's something that I'm always talking about, that when estranged parents, for instance, claim, my kid never told me why they were estranging themselves from me, I just don't believe it. There are so many testimonials out there of so many adult children saying, I wrote letters, I left voicemails, I sent texts, I told them in person. They just keep saying they don't know why I estranged myself. He says typically the person who cut them off provided with a detailed description of the reasons, often in the form of a letter. Respondents dismiss such messages as crazy or just plain wrong. He says that the interviewees would point to reasons for the estrangement in the interview, and then in the next sentence claim ignorance as to why they're estranged. So they would literally describe the reason for their estrangement and then claim, I don't know why they're estranged from me. How is it possible to both describe relationship-long conflict and a volcanic incident while simultaneously feeling that one is entirely in the dark as to the causes of the estrangement? And he talks about how some of these interviewees gave this attitude of, yeah, they gave me reasons, but those reasons were crazy. He also talks about the need to take responsibility if you're going to reconcile with a family member. For example, he talks about how a lot of estranged parents blame young people as a whole, and they frame it as this type of cult that their kid decided to distance themselves from them. He says June Lucas provides an example of this perspective. Estranged from her children, she urges parents in similar situations to stop looking for their own possible contribution to the rift. One thing I would say to estranged parents is, don't look for fault in yourself. It is not your fault. That's the one thing we know. It is not your fault. You did not do some horrible thing that deserves this. This is something that is coming out of the ground right now. I don't know why, but it wasn't your fault, and so that's one thing you can be comforted by, and you stop beating yourself up. Stop looking for that answer for what you could have done better. It isn't there. It just isn't there. There's nothing you can do. There's no love that you can give them. Just know that it wasn't you. Yeah, so repeating to somebody you don't know, who could, by the way, very well be at fault, that you're not at fault, doesn't make it true. And I gotta say, it sounds even just based on this paragraph like June Lucas probably has a lot of responsibility to take. But I sort of disagree with Pilmer's notion that, so would her child. Do you think that the child of somebody with such an incapacity for self-awareness and a denial of anything that threatens this idealized self-image should take responsibility for their role in the estrangement? I personally think not. Personally, I'm sure that the child did some things wrong, maybe has some things they could take responsibility for, but why would they do it? Why would they take responsibility for those things with someone who is clearly so determined to not take any responsibility in return? He also cites somebody else who's estranged from their parent, who says she's a mean person, yelled all the time, she lied all the time, she's manipulative, she's a bully. And so I was like, you know what, this makes my life much easier, and I cut the ties. She acts nice and must have said I love you 1,000 times every time I saw her, and it just makes me want to throw up every time I hear it because it doesn't feel real to me. It's just something you say. It really is better that she isn't in my life. So Pilmer says, in contrast, my own research and insights from the family therapy literature point to a different principle. Estrangement is rarely one person's responsibility. So this person needs to take responsibility for their part in dealing with someone who's a bully, who yelled at them their whole life, who manipulated them as a child? I don't think so. This comes off a little victim blaming. And this is a really good segue into part 2, which is my critique of this book. Pilmer absolutely seems to have a bias towards reconciliation being better. He says, you have nothing to lose by offering one last chance under specific conditions. Really, nothing to lose. So in the example he gave of the woman who cut off her brother because he threw an object at her head while she was holding her baby, you can't think of any possible reasons why maybe reconciliation could be dangerous. I don't know, the endangerment of her baby, of herself. She has nothing to lose from letting a man with a history and pattern of violence and recklessness enter her life and her child's life. Really. He seems to think that reconciliation is great because everyone he interviewed who reconciled was happy with it, but this is ignoring the fact that people often experience multiple estrangements with the same person. Just because you interviewed them at a time when they were maybe feeling better about their relationship with this person doesn't mean there's not going to be another volcanic event that causes them to estrange again, maybe this time for good. And also, I'm just really skeptical of the notion that no one he interviewed was regretful about the reconciliation, or that none of them felt like they might have made the wrong choice. Unfortunately, I do know people who tried to maybe step back from problematic family members and decided to reconcile and ended up regretting it and felt like this was a waste of time and energy and just an additional misery that I could have prevented if I just stayed away from that person. And the costs to their welfare can be huge. So I have to wonder, does a sociologist have a deep enough understanding of abuse and manipulation to accurately analyze these interviews? Because his interpretation of some of the things interviewees said was completely different from my own as someone with a background in clinical psychology. Let me give you an example. So he's talking about this couple, this older couple whose first grandchild is born. And this is what happened. Peter, their son, called me and said his wife is in the hospital and that the baby was born sooner than they expected. We were all excited. We said, okay, we're going to get tickets to fly out. Then Peter calls me and goes, oh, you're going to need to rent a car. I asked, what are you talking about? He says, well, you're going to have to stay in a hotel. We were stunned and could barely ask him why. He said, oh, you can't stay with us. We're just too exhausted. We can't have company. Jonas's reaction was immediate. I told him, but we're not company. He says, well, you can stay with us for a couple of days, but then you really have to go to a hotel. I ask why. He replies, oh, it's just too much having you all here and dealing with the baby and everything. Long story short, Olga and I ended up canceling the trip because we didn't want to be treated like that. Jonas and Olga were deeply offended because the young couple failed to live up to their expectations for how a son and daughter-in-law should behave. They blamed the failure on Peter's difficult personality and believed they were standing up for what is right. It's always been that you have to do what Peter says. Well, we started having a backbone. We started speaking up, not in a mean way, but when he wrote to me and said, okay, you guys can come just for these days and then stay in a hotel, I wrote him back and I said no. I said, we have discussed it together. We believe you have to do it the correct way. As an outsider, you might be inclined to ask, why is staying with the parent of a newborn an absolute value? Might it not be worthwhile to compromise one's expectations to be able to see a first grandchild? One can imagine an alternative scenario in which someone considered whether staying with new parents in their own home was indeed a value that could not be compromised. In the view of Jonas and Olga, their refusal to allow them to stay in the same house was a fundamental violation of the parent-child relationship. But another couple might with equal correctness say, so what? Because they are convinced of the absolute value of their expectations, they could not comprehend their son's request. Peter's expectations for their roles, however, are different. He expected that his parents should accept his wishes and allow him independence in making decisions regarding his family. So it seems like Pilmer's take on this is, oh, they just have different expectations for each other. Peter has this expectation for their roles and they have this expectation for their role. And to me, this just feels like an interpretation incredibly rife with blind spots. Pilmer doesn't really acknowledge that the newborn phase is extremely high stress for new parents, with high potential for postpartum mental health issues like postpartum depression, postpartum anxiety, postpartum psychosis, postpartum OCD. The fatigue alone is extremely harmful. He also doesn't really acknowledge that if there's already a history of family stress, then I imagine Peter and his wife were already anticipating that his parents would be a source of stress rather than support. He doesn't really seem to catch Jonas and Olga's lack of empathy for the new parents, how they're centering themselves in something that ultimately is not about them, how they're refusing to compromise with less than 100% of what they want, how they're reacting punitively, basically punishing their son for having a respectful boundary that he was even willing to bend for them. All of these are red flags of possible emotional abuse and manipulation, but it kind of goes over Pilmer's head. Instead, it kind of seems like he thinks the truth is somewhere in the middle because they just have different roles for each other. Now, Pilmer says that there are certain benefits to reconciliation, namely avoiding regret, getting back into the family or reintegration, access to resources, and having a shared lifetime. Now, research shows that people tend to regret the chances they didn't take, not the actions they did take. And estrangement could honestly be framed as either. It could be the action of cutting someone off, or it could be the inaction of reaching out to reconnect. But regardless, I don't think it's healthy for people to choose to do something like reconcile for extrinsic reasons because somebody else told them to, because somebody else said you're going to regret this one day. If they're going to reconcile with someone, it should be because of intrinsic reasons. Encouraging people to make up because you're going to regret it one day is, in my opinion, incredibly enabling behavior. His message is great for situations where two people with equal power both made some mistakes, but keep in mind that his book is going to be read by victims of all kinds: SA, physical abuse, emotional abuse, abuse, people who have already let so much slide, who already struggle to set and maintain boundaries, who already feel so guilty about making the very difficult choice to step away from someone. So having somebody with this amount of authority telling them there are all these benefits to reconciling, I think you should absolutely try it, is in my opinion irresponsible. Also, it's not really clear to me whether his sample of the people he interviewed was unbiased. He used convenience and snowball sampling, which are not meant to be representative of the general population. And listen, like sometimes that's fine. Like my own dissertation used that type of sampling because I wasn't trying to make a statement about the general population as a whole. I was honestly just wanting to hear individual people's stories, but also a plurality of his participants were over the age of 65. 32% of them were over the age of 65, 56% of them were over the age of 55, and 66% of them were over the age of 45. So it seems like he mainly interviewed people who are likely to hold more power in the relationship due to age or due to having the role of a parent. So I'm wondering if maybe he missed the opportunity to interview some younger people who maybe are estranged from their parents or maybe did reconcile and regretted it. Someone to just give him a little bit of a different perspective, just because like it seems like he thinks reconciliation is always the best course of action. And I'm sure that there are people out there who can speak to how that is not always the case. But anyway, I learned a few things as a result of reading this book. I think overall, if you are in some sort of family conflict where both people played a part and have similar amounts of power in the relationship, his advice could be good. But if you're in a situation where you've had to make the very difficult decision to step away from someone and it doesn't seem like they've changed, I honestly think his advice could be a little bit dangerous. But let me know what you thought about this down below, and I'll see you soon.